Hey, what's up guys? This is Clint Losch, and for today's video, what I'm going to be doing is, a player recently approached me, and he is a top 180 man player, six-figure results. He's just a crusher of the $3 rebuys, the $8 games, $15 games. He recently approached me just asking about ways he can increase his ROI. Identifying some spots to work on, and he's just simply looking to improve his game. And that also goes to show you guys, no matter what level you're at, I know when you're playing, you might see some guys that are just crushing it. They're still looking to improve every single day, and that's what makes them the best. So, it could be just a good tip for anybody out there who's maybe just starting, or maybe has been playing for a little while, looking to improve their game. Everybody's improving, from the guys just starting out to the guys that have been playing for 5+ years and are crushing the games. So what this player did was sent me specific hands to review from his 180 man games, and they were interesting spots because, one, he identified some really interesting hands that were good topics for discussion, but also he doctored some 180 man hands to make some really tough decisions. So you'll see in these games, the stack sizes might not always be perfect or whatnot, but he just doctored them to discuss lines, discuss some pre-flop plays, post-flop plays, and he provided me with a notepad of questions for each of the hands. So I'm going to pull up that notepad and get the comments that were posed to me, and then I'm simply just going to respond, based upon the hand and based upon his comments. So I'm using Universal Replayer. Since he doctored the hands, it was tough to put into my Hold'em Manager so that I could see stats. So we're going to go HUDless here, which, if you see my previous videos, I really like to load hand histories into the HUD, because I get to see stats, figure out how to exploit opponents. But the other thing you can do, if you're reviewing a game and you don't have stats, always look up players on SharkScope. Just knowing whether they're a winning player or a random player or a losing player can give you an idea based upon ranges. If you see a guy is a big winning player, you can be pretty confident that he's playing some very solid pushing and calling ranges, and you don't need to guess too much on those. With randoms, they can always do random crazy stuff. So, we'll talk in some generalities since we don't have stats about what to do versus different opponents. But, I think it'll be fine. So, here is the first hand that was posed to me. So, first hand here, we see our 180 man crusher. That's what I renamed him to keep him anonymous. First hand he picks up is 9-10 suited. Pretty deep here. Got roughly 17 big blinds, and he shoves. Actually, he stopped it before he shoved. But his question was, and I'll pull up his question. Okay to shove 17 big blinds into 2 aggro regs in the blinds. So that's the question. Should we be shoving 17 big blinds here? And to figure out whether we should be shoving or not, what I did was I did a comparison. I wanted to see, since we're dealing with a 180 man game here, obviously pre-final table, we're going to be doing chip EV calculations. So I did a sit and go wizard chip EV calculation just to get some, see if this is a plus EV shove or not. And then I'm going to go to my Card Runners EV program to make a decision tree about determining whether raise folding or just raising in general is going to produce a more profitable result if we are going to be raise folding to these players. So why don't I pull up sit and go wizard here. And guys, if you are using sit and go wizard, the one thing that's always a difficulty, which I'm not sure why they never fixed, when inputting ranges, you can only use the slider, so you can't input specific hands. So that's a slight downfall. This person might be calling king queen before they call, ace 5 potentially. But if we look at this 10-9 suited. We give these players some average ranges. Now, he did say that these regs were on the more aggressive side. So, maybe they're calling a little bit looser. If they are calling looser, let's just make the big blind just a little bit looser. Let's just say we go to 20%. This starts bringing down the chip EV, obviously. So if we give them average ranges, let me go backwards real quick. 13, 14%. You can see that a shove is going to be plus EV. Okay, looks like we're going to win roughly 200 chips. And if we make them any wider, this guy any wider, you can see that starts to go down. So depending on how wide they are, you're in the 150 to 200 chip plus EV range. Now, if you were analyzing this in your own game, you'd say, wow, that's pretty good. It's a plus EV play. You're happy about that, and you move on. But as I said, my question is, should we be shoving 17 big blinds? Or can we do something different, better, such as just raising? So let's pull up the Card Runners EV program that I like to use. And what I did was, at first, I gave roughly the same range that they were 3-bet shoving with. So this is roughly the same range we had him 3-bet shoving with. If we do the EV calculation for that, is raise folding better? You could see that here, if you follow my cursor, raise folding versus similar ranges that they would be calling it all in with will result in a plus EV situation of 538 chips. Now, with that being said, since we're a bit deeper here, and these are aggressive regs, they could be quite simply 3-betting much wider than they would call an all-in. And I think that's a pretty safe assumption here. They're going to be 3-betting much wider than they would call a 17 big blind shove all-in. So let's account for that. Now let's make the big blind, since he's got a bigger stack, he's in the big blind, let's just make him wider. Let's give him Broadway hands, any pocket pair. As you can see, I'm going to go pretty wide here. Any ace. He might be 3-bet jamming more of these suited connectors, but let's do like 27%, 28%. That's a pretty wide range. Okay, so we are accounting for the comments where this player is pretty aggressive. So you can see, if you have one player that's maybe average, 3-betting you around the 15% range, and then we loosen up another player, let me bring this over here, we loosen up another player to 3-bet close to 30%, which is really, really wide, raising and folding results in 332 chips, which we showed was significantly better than if we gave these players a 15% all-in calling range if you shove. So in this situation, my point is, we can play around with these ranges a lot to get the desired result, but you can see, even if I go really, really wide with a 3-betting range, raising is still going to produce better results than shoving all in this deep. So as one last thing, let's just mess around. Let's give this guy a really wide range too. So let's say they're both insane and are shoving, this really wide range. Let's give him, he's in the small blind, maybe 3-bets a little bit lighter, so 23%. So 23% and 28% 3-betting. And we get down to that 200 chip range. So you can see, for a raise let me take a step back, for a shove to even be as close to the profitability of raising, the 3-betting ranges need to be significantly wider than the all-in calling range. So my rule of thumb for this is, you pretty much always want to be in raise fold or raise call mode, especially when you're this deep. And if you've seen other videos I made, I recommend that all the way down to 10 big blinds and even shorter sometimes. So the point is, you want to be typically more in that raise call, raise fold game until you know otherwise. Like, if you know that these guys are going to sit there and 3-bet jam on you with ace deuce and 7-8 and stuff like that, and really, really wide, sure, then playing more unexploitable and more of a push-fold game might be more appropriate. So I would only make that play if I had that specific note. If you don't, then I would operate under these conditions. So again, it always comes back to what you know about these players. And until you know specifically, that's when I would change up my game. Now, what he did was he doctored, for this hand, it looks very similar. It pretty much is. He gave himself 9/8 suited this time, um, but he made himself shorter as well. So slightly worse hand, slightly shorter stack. And he said, well, should we shove here? Again, this is exactly the same scenario. You could still shove. It's still going to be plus EV. Okay? But since I also want to talk about how the stack sizes affect things. Before you're a little bit deeper, so they might feel that they could 3-bet you, potentially a little bit wider because they have more fold equity. With that being said, we're a little bit shorter here. So if you're shorter, does that mean we need to shove? Potentially shoving becomes more viable. It's easier to shove a little bit shorter of a stack. But I still like the raise fold scenario because when you are shorter, players also should probably assume a little bit less fold equity. So their 3-betting ranges will be potentially a bit tighter. So again, I'm still operating under the raising, philosophy and adjusting from there rather than shoving until I know what these guys are capable of doing. If these guys were also loose and maybe not regs, they were loose passive players, I would probably lean more towards shoving as well, making the plus EV shove rather than, we're dealing here with regs who are either 3-betting or folding. If you're bringing in randoms and loose players, then you're dealing more with, you can bring calling into the equation as well. Could they call your raise, play at it, and play post flop? Sure. Playing in position is always going to be good, but you may not want to get in the post flop scenarios with awkward stack sizes. So I would lean more towards the shove in that scenario. But my recommendation here was just because you're short doesn't mean we necessarily need to shove. Less chips could mean they may think less fold equity. So raising is still going to produce more profitable results than shoving, as long as they're not 3-betting a ridiculously wide range. So let's hop to the next hand. Now we get same scenario again. So as I said, he doctored a couple hands to bring up how you would play different hands in similar scenarios. So I think this was really good to go through. So we had 9-10 suited, 9-8 suited. The 9-10 suited is a little deeper. Now we have the same stack size as the hand before, 9-10 offsuit. Here, this is an easier situation to just raise because quite simply your hand is worse than 9-8 suited and 9-10 suited. They were plus EV shoves because if you get called, your hand's just going to perform better than 9-10 off as well. So here, it's just because your hand is worse, raising is going to be better, risking less to win the same amount and more happily raise fold, potentially. Let me pull up the questions. And before, he was asking, should I just wait, just shove, 13 big blinds, so we addressed those. So now in the next two hands, you will see he put a situation together where he's really short. 4 big blinds. We've got regs who know you're capable of shoving any 2 cards potentially, so they're going to call really wide. Here's my thoughts on this. You really can't go too wrong, in my opinion. You're in desperation mode. So shoving here really isn't wrong. Obviously, you have practically no fold equity, so I understand waiting for a slightly better hand. I would probably most likely just shove this hand, given you have antes in play, you have a face card, and only going through 2 players. So if the big blind is potentially going to call you with any 2 cards, then your hand here, just having a face card, is actually going to perform pretty well. All things being equal there, just because you have a face card. So it's Jack 4 off. Could you shove, wait for a better hand? Can't really fault you for that, but I wouldn't mind just getting it in here through 2 players and hoping and praying your cards hold. But again, if you're going to get called by any 2 cards, having just a face card is a good thing. So let's go to the next hand. Similar scenario. Instead of Jack 4, we have 5-6 off. Now, if we assume that the big blind is going to call with pretty much any two cards, your Jack 4 hand, like 5-6 might look nicer, but Jack 4 actually performs better just because you have a high card, and if he's going to be calling with any two, which is going to include a lot of hands that aren't beating Jack High. So Jack High is going to perform even better than 5-6, but I would still be shoving this. You still need to take these, even if you're looking these spots up in Sit and Go Wizard or something like that, and you see it's a negative EV shove, negative chip EV shove. That's okay. You can take negative EV shoves when you're getting this short because you're desperate. These are the times where you need to take those negative EV spots so that you can preserve or give yourself the opportunity to make more plus EV plays in future hands. So I would just shove it here, get it in, hope and pray, and if you do have a miracle and get guys to fold, that's obviously a great thing. You almost double up by just taking the blinds. And if you get called, hopefully you have two live cards. That's really what you're after. If these guys were randoms in the blinds, then that's an easier shove because they were probably not going to call with any two cards. So you might actually have an element there of fold equity. So versus regs, they're going to call really wide, so it becomes a bit tougher, and I understand why this question was posed. But yeah, I would go ahead and just shove both of these spots. Okay, so this hand we have King Deuce offsuit from the cutoff, and I believe he opens here. Yep. Now his question was, this is an overall line check. He usually checks top pair, no kicker, this deep on boards. So let's run through the hand real quick. Let's see what happens. So he raises from the cutoff with King Deuce off. Gets called by the blind. Hits top pair, but obviously has no kicker. There's a 10 there. 10s are obviously an easy part of his range. Some potential draws, Queen Jack, even some gut shots. So he decides to check back. So his question is, should he check back here? We get a small bet on the turn. He calls. Bet on the river. And he hits two pair. So as played, he makes a small raise. I really like that play. It's not too big to where you're going to get a lot of folds, but a good amount to where he's going to get a lot of potentially even top pair, but obviously or second pair, maybe even a call, being that small. So I like that raise. I think that's pretty good overall. So his question was, should you check top pair, no kicker this deep on these boards? Not sure if it's good. Don't want to bloat the pot. Want to do some turn bluffs and just reevaluate the river. Bet small if checked on a good board. On river, can we fold if he shoves over the raise? Can't see him shoving less. That would definitely be pretty sick if he shoves over the top of the raise when you have two pair. In game you might end up calling that, and I can't really fault you. Sitting back and analyzing, you probably figured, this guy probably wouldn't be shoving worse. If he had top pair, he's going to do exactly what he did and just call. If he's got King 10 or a set or something like that, he's going to be probably shoving over top. So you could probably make the great fold and fold your two pair versus a random. Overall, I really don't mind how he played it. But before I get into the line check, what I would say, guys, is, like I said, we don't have stats, but be careful with opening this hand. I'm all for opening wide in the ante stage of the game, but when I looked up these guys in Sharkscope and found out they're the button and the small blind are random players. So because they're randoms, they could be fishy players. There's a good chance you're going to play post flop as potentially out of position, assuming that if you look at their stats, their VPIP and preflop raise are pretty loose. So I would rather not get into too many of these spots with some really bad hands like King Deuce offsuit. I would still open a lot of hands that can flop well, but probably avoid the trashier type hands. So that's my little concern about the hand in general, is that you could potentially be putting yourself out of position with a hand that doesn't flop well. But still, it's not bad. playing in position is obviously going to have its advantages. Now, in regards to how it was played, his concern was, should he check top pair no kicker this deep, trying to not bloat the pot. So I don't mind how, like I said, I don't mind how he played it as well. Just to give another line to mix in as well. Not to think you have to play this the same way every single time. I actually don't mind c-betting this board either. I do agree I don't want this pot to get too out of control. However, there are other hands that a random will call you with on this flop that you can get value from, such as maybe second pair, like a lot of tens, jack 10, something like that. Queen jack, obviously a draw. Maybe some gut shot type hands that a random might still call you with. So I would still c-bet, like in the 40% range on this board. If you get called, I actually like firing a turn bet, really small though. So I would potentially get value from second pairs and draws while still having some pot control. And what the turn bet does is potentially get that value, but also provide maybe a river blocker bet. So let's say you bet really small in the turn, you get called, he checks the river, and let's just say we don't improve to two pair, just a brick card comes on the river. You have now the opportunity to check it back. What I see a lot is guys will c-bet this board, get called, check the turn, and then the player will fire out a big river bet. And now you have no idea what to do with top pair bad kicker. Do you turn your hand into a bluff catcher? You put yourself in a really awkward spot and you really don't know where you are. I really hate turning hands like this into a bluff catcher. So often you might be calling raises that are much bigger than you like because you think top pair there is still good. So I like to take a little bit more control, fire the flop, even with a marginal hand, potentially fire the turn, but small, so that one, it's getting potential value from worse. If you get raised at that point, you could certainly get away from the hand. 3, I'm going to bet an amount smaller than I think I would potentially have to call on the river. So I can use the turn bet actually as a blocker bet, if I am behind at that point. So that's another approach. Especially if you're one of those people that it's firing c-bets with, you have a good hand that has I like to do this when I have showdown value. So if you have some showdown value and you find yourself c-betting, getting called, checking, and then you're facing this big river bet, especially if you know your opponent's aggressive, it can give you a lot of headaches. So that's just another way to play it. Let's go to the next hand. So he's got king deuce again, gets called. Now, obviously, it changed up the board. You can see he gave himself top pair with a flush draw. For same reasons above, I would c-bet here, in the 40%, 50% range. Let me actually see what his question was about this hand. So over the next two hands, is how much would he vary his bet sizing, assuming he's betting these flops, standard c-bet for balance. So he's asking. So this is a question for the next two hands. You'll see he's got king deuce in both of them. So his question is, what should his c-betting size be? Should he be varying his bet size for balance, or bet bigger to protect his hand, smaller to induce check raises? So let's talk about this hand first. King deuce, you have top pair. Obviously, our flush draw really doesn't matter a whole lot. I would probably still c-bet this board. You have top pair. You might get called by a lot of diamonds. If he's a more aggressive player that could check raise with a lot of diamonds, it's a little bit trickier of a spot. But I'm still c-betting here. I wouldn't go too much bigger than 40% or 50% on this particular situation. You have a marginal hand, but you can still get value from some diamonds. Also, you don't really want to go too small and give a lot of room to potentially check raise. So, in his comments, he mentioned balance. To be honest, I don't really care about balancing. We already said this guy was a random player. I don't care about balancing versus randoms. All I'm trying to do versus random players is maximize the amount of chips I'm getting from that player at that time. I care more about balance when I'm dealing with good regs who are capable of taking notes and exploiting. So I would c-bet. He just ended the hand there about what he should do, which brings us right into the next hand, where same situation, but now he flops the nuts. He flops the nut flush. What should he do? Should you c-bet? Should you check it back? I actually think this is a little bit player-based. If this guy was a reg, I like c-betting, because they expect you, a reg will expect you to c-bet every single time. I like c-betting these boards in general if I didn't have a nut flush. So I'd be c-betting this board regardless, so I'm going to do it with the nuts as well, and I'll probably do it small. The same thing goes for if you're playing a random player and he's on the more aggressive side. Maybe you see he's playing like 30-28 or something like that. I'd probably still c-bet. I'm sorry. I would probably actually potentially check it back. Maybe get him to spaz out on future streets. If a guy is on the loose passive side, I would probably c-bet. You're going to get called by a lot. You can't really count on bluffs at future streets from the passive players, so I'd want to start getting chips in now. Still betting relatively small. Maybe against, again, the loose, aggressive guys. Try to let them catch up, potentially. The worst thing that could happen here is a diamond falling. It pretty much kills a lot of the action, especially if they have a marginal diamond or no diamond at all. But I still think in a sit-and-go, c-betting's still good, since a lot of guys expect you to c-bet anyway on these boards regardless. The only times I really check back flops when I have the nuts is like if you just crush the board where nobody else can have anything. You have pocket queens on a queen deuce deuce board. How many hands can a guy have, your opponent have on that board? So I would check back, like, sets on really dry boards or full house type situations. So here I don't think we necessarily need to check back. All right, so Jack 10. Let's see what happens here. Okay, so he changed his hand. Now instead of having top pair, he gives himself second pair. So let's see what his question was about this hand. This is hand 9. Do you sometimes check back the flop versus aggressive players? What about passive ones? If you c-bet and they call, just check back the turn and river blanks with second pair. So he's just asking, what do we do with second pair versus, a random player that could potentially be loose or passive? How would I play it? With second pair and some draws on board, I'm still usually c-betting. I don't really want to give free cards for draws and potentially live cards if he's got some live cards as well. He doesn't always have to hit this board. He can have ace-x, some potential draws here. So I want to charge those hands. And I'm really just happy to take down the hand now rather than potentially get into bluff catching scenarios on future streets as well. If the small blind starts firing, on the turn or on the river. And as I mentioned before, if I c-bet small here, maybe just like no more than 600, and I get called, like I mentioned in that king deuce hand, I don't mind firing the turn either as more for probably a blocker in this situation to kind of, because I have showdown value here. With second pair, I want to get the showdown as cheaply as possible, so firing a small double barrel might actually get you to that point, rather than potentially call raise on the river if you go bet, check, and then call. So I'm still c-betting here. All right, so we have Queen Jack. So his question here, DJ Arrow H, or DJero H, he's a reg in these games, and his question is, so this is hand 10, is this a standard 3-bet versus a reg, or why bother with 4 guys still behind? Does flatting stink, or is it okay? If he's 3-bet folding versus him, should I normally just be flatting here? Not sure what would be the general concept. So the difficulty about this hand, as he stated, is that, yes, we get a reg to open. And when you 3-bet regs, you know that you can many times eliminate them flatting. If you 3-bet to like 1200 here, they're not going to flat as much as a random player would. So if you 3-bet, you usually have to worry: are they going to fold or are they going to 4-bet? So accordingly, you can usually 3-bet bluff versus regs. Now, what makes this situation tough is you have 4 players left to act, at least 2 of which we know are random players. They're the same guys from before. I think this guy might be a reg, and I'm not sure about the guy in the big blind. So you have, it's an interesting situation because of the players to your left. So I don't think it's necessarily a standard 3-bet because you have these 4 players left to act, several of which are random. So you don't even know you can get into, if you 3-bet, you're essentially looking to isolate, and you don't even know if you're going to get into an isolated situation. And I always ask, we always talk about, hey, should we 3-bet this guy? It's always posed in my Skype groups, coaching sessions. But before you can decide, I have Queen Jack and I'm going to 3-bet, what's the opening range here? I know he's a reg, but there are loose regs and there are really tight regs. You got some regs that are playing like 1917 and other guys that are playing 1412. So is this one of those guys that's really tight with his opening range from early position through an entire table? If so, 3-betting is not going to be too great of a play versus those guys. If you have guys that are capable of opening a lot of ace-X and broadways and every pocket pair, then you're also going to have a lot of there's going to be a lot of hands he's going to raise and fold out. Then sure, we could 3-bet to exploit those regs, definitely. So I would first ask, what's the range here? Ask yourself that. Always ask, how wide is he opening? Is there a lot of hands he's opening that he's going to be folding as well? So if there's a big gap between opening range and what he would potentially 4-bet or get it all in with, then you can go ahead and exploit that open. Is he opening wider than normal from early position here? And given the unknowns with the players to your left, I may just look to get out of the way here. If you can get this reg to raise fold often, then I like 3-betting small in general. And Queen Jack has some value post flop, so flatting maybe when you're on the button or isn't the worst scenario either. Since this is a hand that, since it could play well potential post flop and you have position, may have more value flatting. But in general, I don't mind 3-betting him either, but I would rather do it from the button or even better from the blinds, because we said there's not going to be a lot of post flop play here. If you 3-bet, he's either probably going to be folding a lot or 4-betting rather than flatting. You want to do that with as few people left to act behind you. So those are the positions I'd probably do it from, button or even in the blinds. Okay, so these next couple hands I remember, he's figured out what to do with these good hands but marginal hands in terms of should you 3-bet get it all in here. So here we have, ace queen versus an early position raise. The question is, do we 3-bet get it in? I don't think I want to 3-bet get it in here with ace queen. And he actually calls, so we'll get into that. But his question was, should we 3-bet get it in? This is an average reg opening up. So versus your average under the gun opening range, I still don't know if this guy's going to be looser or tighter, but if we just base it on averages, 3-betting versus that average range, maybe like king queen, some ace-8 plus, pocket 4s. I mean, it certainly could be wider depending on the reg, so there's where you really need to rely on stats and notes. But this is usually going to be a negative EV 3-bet, especially when you have a lot of players still left to act, plus the under the gun range could be a little bit tighter. So I guess the point is, unless it's really wide, err on the side of being a little bit more conservative here. Nothing can end the game quicker than 3-bet jamming too wide versus a range that is tighter than you really needed to be profitable. But in this situation, I actually don't mind flatting, but with the intention that if you're going to flat here, since you have a manageable stack, you're pretty deep, so you can flat a little bit. You have position on him, but I'm only going to flat players, especially regs, with the intention that I'm not going to fold to every c-bet, because we know, look, the majority of the time, 2/3 of the time, we're going to miss the flop. So I don't want to call with the potential of, always folding when I miss. I mean, ace queen can play very well, especially when we hit. But when we don't hit, if we do get into an isolated pot here, so let's see, calls, and everybody folds. So we are an isolated pot. We have position. we get a board here that's really dry. High card board, obviously rainbow board. We know that a player is going to c-bet this every single time. And he c-bets pretty small, and I like his c-bet size. But as I said, my game plan here is I'm not folding to this c-bet. Because we know he's c-betting everything, ace-jack, ace-10, every pocket pair, I'm going to call here and try to take it away on a future street. So if he goes ahead and checks the turn, I'm going to head and fire the turn. If another card comes and he fires a turn bet that's even bigger, okay, then we might need to get away. He might actually have the hand. But so often people are going to fire a c-bet. You call them on this board thinking, oh, he's probably only going to be able to call with a king. They check the turn. We can now fire the turn. So I'm only going to be calling raises in these spots with the intention that I'm not going to be folding every single time. So now we get the same thing. Instead of ace queen, you have pocket sevens. Really, this is obviously the same situation as above. And I like calling here, definitely. 3-betting, again, just talking about, the question was, should he 3-bet? 3-betting is still going to be probably a negative EV scenario. And I didn't mention this last hand, but I also want to bring up, guys, if you're playing against regs, one thing you're not really supposed to do is flat. So that's a good thing. Flatting looks very strong to regs because since it's not what you're supposed to do, they might think that you just have aces or kings, and you don't want to 3-bet and get them off their hand. So as I said, flatting can look really strong, so you can use that to your advantage. So he could certainly assume that you have a premium hand here, making it easier on you to take it away post flop. Also, naturally, the rest of the table also plays a role. So if it's an ultra loose table, then flatting is going to be much trickier since you may find yourself in a multi-way pot. But with a pocket pair, multi-way would not be a bad scenario either since you can set mine. But in general, obviously we're really looking to get into an isolated situation. So be a little bit careful when you have loose random players to your left in these types of scenarios. Let me see what happened actually. I'm not sure if he finished the hand. Okay, so I think he fired out again. Again, it's a doctored hand. He just wants to know more what to do pre-flop and on the flop. But so now, same scenario. What to do with aces. So guys, if you're capable of flatting with ace queen and pocket sevens versus regs, perfectly fine with doing it with aces as well. It shows pretty good balance. Shows that the other regs can't predict what you're doing this with. So many guys only do this with pocket aces because it's such an easy hand to play. But if you can vary what you're doing it with, then you really keep players on your toes. So let's go to the flop, and let me make sure what the question was. What hand are we on? We're hand on 13. He just asked, is this situation okay? So again, same c-bet. He just calls, and the hand ended. So he just wanted to know what to do on the flop. I think he wanted to know should he raise the flop. On this dry of a board, I don't like raising this flop. If he's got a king, we're going to get plenty of value on future streets on the turn and river. We're going to be able to get probably his whole stack. If he doesn't have a king and maybe he has like pocket sevens, then raising at this point you might, or if he has ace queen, or obviously less likely since you have an ace. But if he's got a marginal hand on this board, you're probably gonna, if you raise this, you're probably gonna get all those hands to fold. So just calling, I like. You're gonna get value from a king anyway. If he's got worse, you could potentially get him either bluff or maybe even catch up on future streets as well and get value from those hands. So raising isn't going to accomplish too much here. So I like just flatting. All right, let's go to the next hand. Jack 6 offsuit. I have no idea what the question was with Jack suit. Let's see. I guess he's just figuring whether he should open or not. Hand 14. Oh, so he's saying, should he raise call the big blind? I see. Okay, the big blind is short here. So should you open here? Should you open here with the intention of raise folding to the small blind, raise calling the big blind? In general, guys, it's plus EV to raise call the big blind here, or to raise in general and then raise call the big blind when you're in the post-ante stage. So whether it's plus EV or negative EV is not really my concern. It's going to show a profit. The only concern I have in these situations is if there's regs in the blinds, therefore if you have to raise call and show down your hand, you're showing them how wide you can open. And if they're paying attention, this is a note that they can take on you. Given that these guys are randoms, I look these guys up ahead of time. They're random players. I'm fine with opening this in this situation. But again, if you're dealing with more of a reg-filled table, and again, you guys know my style if you've seen other videos, I really like to open up really wide. My stats really go through the roof in the VPIP preflop raise area. But I often don't really want to show guys what I'm capable of opening with. It might make it a little bit easier to them to take a note and exploit me later on. So, plus EV, yes, versus regs, showing down this bad hand, that's my only concern. And I think it's the same scenario. So, same scenario, he gave himself 5-6 suited this time. I actually like this hand better all around. It performs better versus the big blinds range as well, since he's not going to be 3-bet jamming any 2 cards, but, a lot of aces and broadways and stuff like that. So 5-6 suited should perform pretty well. Plus, it's actually a more respectable hand to show down. So if you flip over this hand, I don't think anybody can really fault you there for opening and calling. So that's not really giving regs a clue as to how wide you're opening there. Queen Jack off, so we open. We get called. Okay, so before I set up this hand, you could see, again, this is a doctored hand, just gave everybody, let's see, looks like, what he's saying is the guy that calls, he's a passive player. So he gave everybody pretty deep, or not pretty deep, but, an okay stack, 16 big blinds. And he labeled the big blind as being passive. So what's his question here? Sorry. So this is hand 16. If he's passive, should you check the flop or c-bet? So let's now go to the hand. So you flop an open-ended draw here. Versus a passive player, I actually don't mind either play, checking or betting. I hate waffling and being on the fence. Typically, if I have a good amount of, here's just my general considerations. Typically, if I have a good amount of outs, I like to check back to give myself the free card so that I just simply don't get raised off my hand. Like, that's the worst situation. You raise when you have your draw. He raises or jams you, and you really can't call at that point, considering you have no fold equity. You're just hoping to hit your outs. So usually when I have a lot of outs, like you have a straight draw, flush draw, even a bigger draw, I like to check back, give myself that free card potentially. But given he's passive, you probably don't have to worry about getting check raised here. So with that said, if you c-bet and get called, you may need to check back the turn, depending on the size of the pot and the stack sizes. So c-betting and checking the turn to get a free river is probably my game plan here. Let's see how he played it. So he does, he checks it back. He hits his hand. The guy bets out. He just calls. And so it calls and then raises the river. So I actually don't mind the way he played that at all, as played. I just wanted to give it another option. You could c-bet it, check the turn if you get a free one, so that you get a free river. Either way should be fine. Okay, so we got Queen Jack again. Still dealing with a passive player. Let's see what his question is real quick on this board. 17. He says you're usually clueless on these spots. Should he bet the turn small to see where he's at? Or which stats do I check on river to determine if it's worth the call and try to catch a bluff or to try to chop the pot? Or just c-bet the flop? Okay, so he's just wondering what the hell to do in general post-flop. So let's just run through this and I'll give my game plan. Okay, yep, so he's got, let's go backwards. So he's got second pair. He decides to check the flop versus a passive player. The passive player fires the turn, fires the river. Should he call to be a bluff catcher? Okay. So my game plan here, guys, is, and I've talked a little bit about this before, we have second pair here. I want to get to showdown relatively cheaply, while also potentially getting value from worse hands along the way. So that usually means that I'm c-betting here, and also probably betting the turn, like really small, like in the 30 to 40% range. I just don't like getting into bluff catching scenarios too often with hands like second pair, especially versus unknown opponents. The question was also posed, like, what stats do we look at to determine if we should be a bluff catcher? He said that this guy's a passive player. So if he's firing the turn and river, you have to be concerned that he simply has top pair or better here. Because if he's a passive player, they usually like to check call a lot. So when they're actually betting, that might give you a clue that when a passive player is raising and betting, that he probably has a hand. So, and if he had a more marginal hand, he'd probably just be checking and potentially calling the whole way. So I'll give him credit here for having a good hand. And if you're unsure, then err on the side of being conservative. That's the thing. If you're going to put your chips at risk, a large portion or all of them, I always say, err on the side of being more conservative and not putting your whole stack at risk if you're in an unknown scenario. So I would just check it here. All right, let's get to the next hand. Let's see what the question is. Looks like, okay. This is hand 18. Okay, he's got King 9 suited. Should he just shove this versus 2 loose aggressives and 1 passive opponent? Okay, so we renamed the players here. Everybody's got 16 big blinds. Lag 1, lag 2, and passive. As I said before, I apologize if I sound like a broken record, but I really want to hammer this point home. In the post-ante stage, opening up is going to show a plus EV result in general, given the value of the pot plus the antes at a full table. So this is just a general strategy consideration. I usually need a good reason to fold at this stage when it's folded to me in a position like this. So with that said, I know the concern is that you have loose aggressive players to your left who may 3-bet you wide. But the question is how wide? In terms of dealing with 3-bets, you need these players to 3-bet you, and we saw it before, with like a 25, 28, 30% range to make opening a negative EV play, or to make shoving even better. I'm not assuming that these guys are going to be 3-betting you that wide versus your cutoff open, unless you have really good info on them. And also, versus a passive player in the big blind, I'm happy to play in position versus him in general. And King 9 suited can play pretty well post flop as well. So you're actually in a very advantageous spot if you get called in the blinds. So I want you to keep in mind that when you're in the ante stage of the game, you need players to 3-bet very, very wide and very often to truly exploit your open and make it negative EV. So I would more often than not be just, I think, yeah, he just wants to know if he should open. I'd be opening here before I start shoving 16 big blinds. If you know that these guys can just 3-bet jam you with like a 30% of the time or more, and you can look at their 3-bet versus steal stats. If you see that they're 15 to 20%, that might give you an indication they're more aggressive. But as I said, guys, when you're comparing, especially a deep shove versus opening, the 3-betting ranges need to be so significant to turn a shove into better than just purely opening and potentially folding. So I think for the most part, that was the rule of thumb for most of these spots. Especially for you 180-man guys. I know for a long time 180-mans have been, you put your chart next to you, your Nash charts, and you just determine whether to push or fold, no matter whether you have 15 big blinds or 10. You just take the plus EV shove, and that's how you went and made money in these games. And for a long time, you could 30 and 40 table these 180 mans, play based upon the charts, and be on your way. That's not the same anymore, especially in the non-rebuy 180s. The rebuy 180s are reg filled, yes, but you still have the advantage of having bigger stacks versus the fishy players, and they're slightly easier games in general. But for the $8 180 mans, the $15 180 mans, they're tough games because you have a lot of regs. So if all these regs are sitting there with that chart next to them, where's your edge going to come from? You're going to play a zero-sum game at that point if you're all just playing with the same ranges. So the way to get your advantage over these guys is not by shoving 16 big blinds. It's by playing a more raise-fold, raise-call game. And if you play that type of game, it'll give you confidence to open up your a lot of trash hands to steal as well. You know, a lot of times I find guys getting into a very polarized situation. Whereas, like, if they have 13 or 14 big blinds, they'll shove ace-queen and ace-jack and pocket sixes because they don't want to get in a post-flop scenario or anything like that. But then they'll min-raise pocket aces, and then they'll potentially min-raise trashy hands or even just fold them. And it's a very polarizing situation to get into. So what I like to do is pretty much raise my entire range, especially if you're dealing with more regs who aren't going to flat you. Raise the entire range, so that gives you confidence to know that, okay, I'm going to be min-raising aces. I'm going to be min-raising, ace-queen and potentially raise-calling. I'm going to min-raise 7-deuce offsuit as a steal. So I'm going to do it with my entire range. And that's where raising will give you more confidence. If you feel that you always have to shove here with 16 big blinds, then you're simply just going to miss a lot of spots where you can be picking up chips. So, actually, if we look at this hand and I actually skip forward to another hand, this was versus a lag. He asked what to do versus loose aggressive opponents here, shove or raise. I said raise is better. Now, if you go to this hand, it's the same thing, but he renamed the opponents Nit 1, Nit 2, and Nit 3. And I want to say, guys, forget that you have King 9 suited. If they're nits, they're not going to be flatting. They're going to be 3-betting or folding. You're not going to play post-flop, so you could literally open any 2 cards here. So who cares if you have King 9 suited? This is a much better spot to even open. So I actually want to leave it right here. If you see, there's actually 36 doctored hands in this, really tricky spots to get comments on. This is gonna be part 1. I'm gonna do a part 2 with the rest. They'll bring about some more interesting discussion as well. So hopefully, in these hands, I thought it was really good that oftentimes we do a hand history review with a full game. I thought this was great that he picked specific hands that happened to him, but then also changed around the hands and the stack sizes to see how you would play different hands in different situations versus different players. So I thought there was really good discussion here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it as well. And stay tuned for part 2 here for the next video where I'll finish the rest of these hands. Thanks, guys.